It's a good news day for us. It's like a big deal. We are at the point now, we're starting the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, which obviously is a big thing because it's a sign of achievement. It indicates that we're making progress. Sometimes when you do a Mishnah at a time and you go into it in depth, it feels like perhaps you're never going to make progress. So it should be reassuring and encouraging for all of us that we have moved to the next chapter. And it's quite a big Mishnah to start with. Before we start looking at the content of the Mishnah, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the Mishnah that we're about to learn today is attributed to who is called over here Rebbe. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, it's important because a Nasi, in the previous chapter, we learned that you often get, at that period in history, get these pairs of rabbis who kind of worked together in collaboration, where the one had the title and the role of Nasi, and the other had the title and role of Av Beis Din. The Nasi is the spiritual leader of the Jewish community and sometimes also the political leader. And the Av Beis Din is the head of the judiciary. So at this point, we've now moved away from that, and the person who is quoted in each Mishnah from the last few Mishnahs, the last three Mishnahs of the previous chapter and this Mishnah, we only focus on the Nasi. This particular Nasi is called Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who is referred to by the abbreviation Rebbe, also sometimes referred to as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the Holy Rabbi. He's famous for many things, one of which is that he is the personality who put together the Mishnah. So the commentaries ask a question: how come it is, if in the previous chapter we were talking about people who were part of the chain of tradition? You remember the previous chapter started off by saying Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, and then he passed it on to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua passed it on to the elders, and etc. And then we went through the chain. So-and-so received from so-and-so, so-and-so received from so-and-so. So the commentaries ask, how come it is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who received the tradition and the teachings from his own father, Rabban Gamliel, how come he's not in that chapter, in the first chapter, where he should have been part of the chain of tradition? It almost feels like he's been separated from everybody else, and you could mistakenly imagine that to mean that in some way he is of a lower stature than everybody who came before him. So the commentaries offer a number of different suggestions as to what it means that he was separated from everybody else. One suggestion that is made is because he was so great that he actually was beyond his predecessors. And for that reason, he was given the opportunity, or given this special accolade, so to speak, of being separated from everybody else. It's one explanation that is given. Another explanation that is given, now you see the funny thing with that is that he's the one who ordered the Mishnah. So it would be a bit unusual to suggest that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said about himself, I'm so great, I'm in a category and class of my own, so put himself into the beginning of the next Mishnah. Other commentaries for that reason say that it's because what he's going to teach us today is a very generic, overarching principle of Judaism. And because it's such an important principle and such an overarching principle, so for that reason, it's set apart from everything else. It's set apart from the rest of the Mishnahs that precede and that follow it, because it's like in a class of its own. Sometimes you get these very broad concepts that are valuable to more than just a specific point. Okay, so either way, it's very clear that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is given this unusual respect and honor to be the head of a chapter. So let's see what it is that he has to teach us. So there you have it, Rebbe Oimer. Rebbe, again, is the abbreviation of his name. Rebbe, as if to say he is the teacher, the rabbi of all of Israel. So Rebbe Oimer, Rebbe taught the following things. Number one, Eizoihi derech yeshara sheyavor loy ha'adam. What is the straight and upright path that a person should choose for themselves? Okay? So before we go any further, and before we look at what his answer is, you do have to wonder about the question. This is a rabbi. It's in the Mishnah. Surely the path that you're supposed to follow is keep the Torah? How can you even ask this question? What is the upright and straight path? How's that even a question? The upright and straight path is follow the Torah. So we need to ask ourselves that question, what is the nature of his question? And then he answers it. And if you found the question to be a little bit strange, you may find the answer to be even stranger. Because again, if you're asking the question, for whatever reason, which path in life should a Jewish person pursue, you would definitely expect the answer to be follow the Torah and mitzvahs. And it's not what he says. So what does he say? Well, he says a few things. Number one, kol shehi tiferes lo'oiseha v'siferes lo'i min ha'adam. The word tiferes means beauty. So what is the path that you should follow? The so-called straight and upright path that a person should choose. Whatever will be beautiful for the practitioner, in other words, will be beautiful for you, and tiferes lo'i min ha'adam, it will bring you beauty from other people. So that kind of sounds like what he's saying is you should choose a path in your Judaism that has mutual benefit, both to yourself and to those around you. Again, it seems like a strange answer. What is the path that you should follow? You should follow the path of Torah and mitzvahs. Why are you saying a path that is beautiful? You know how open that is? You know how people can misinterpret that? People say, what I do is, it works for me and I don't hurt anybody in the process. That's quite a common way of thinking in the modern world. You know, people say, do what makes you happy. Have you ever heard this? Do what makes you happy. As long as nobody else gets hurt in the process. I think this is one of the things that's really important about learning Torah, is that we always have to make sure that we're learning what the rabbi said and not what we would like the rabbi to have said. So when he says Tiferes lo yiseh v'tiferes lo min ha'adam, let's not filter it through our particular outlook on life. Let's understand what Tiferes means in Judaism, and let's understand what it means in this particular context. So his first thing is the Tiferes principle, which we need to understand and appreciate. Then he says, V'hevei zohir b'mitzvah kala kevachamura. You should be zohir, you should be cautious with a so-called light or easy mitzvah, as you would be bachamura with a heavy or strict mitzvah. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that he's implying that there are certain mitzvahs which are bigger, if you can say such a thing, and certain mitzvahs which are smaller. And that's why he's telling us, be as careful with the so-called small mitzvahs as you are with the so-called big mitzvahs. So we need to understand this concept. What does that mean? How do you start to grade mitzvahs? So one possible way to do it is certain mitzvahs are easier to do and other mitzvahs are more difficult to do. And in fact, that was Rebbe's personal experience. There's a whole story that the Gemara tells us about Rebbe, that there was a girl who used to work for them in their house, and she was an orphan girl, so she had a difficult background. And on one particular occasion, he wasn't as sympathetic as he was supposed to have been to her difficulties. And the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi suffered for a period of time his own physical pain because of the fact, like as retribution, for the fact that he wasn't as sensitive to this girl as he should have been. And then the Gemara tells us later on, what happened was he saw somebody who was mistreating animals. I've seen two versions of the story. The version I've always seen was that they were mice. Recently I saw a version that they were cats or kittens. And he intervened and he said, no, Rachamav al kol ma'asav. The Torah tells us that Hashem has compassion for all of these creatures, and therefore you should treat even these pests with dignity. And at that point his suffering stopped. So some of the commentaries say that's a mitzvah kala. How difficult is that? How difficult is it to do a simple mitzvah like look after an animal that it shouldn't be harmed? And he was careful about that mitzvah in the one instance. Kevachamura, it was like the more serious issue that he dealt with, which is not to show compassion. And again, of course, it's at his level, relative to his ability, not to show compassion to an orphan. So there you have this principle of mitzvah kala. It's It's interesting. Some commentaries say that a mitzvah kala, a simple mitzvah, is like chasing away the mother bird. The Torah tells us if you want to take fledglings, you want to take eggs. So before you can take them, you have to chase the mother bird so that you're not being cruel to the mother and taking her young in front of her face. So that's what some of the Mefarshim say. That's a mitzvah kala. It's an easy. How difficult is that to do? How difficult is it? It doesn't cost you money. And it doesn't necessarily take a long time, although some of the other commentaries disagree and they say actually it could take a long time because the mother's not going to leave so quickly and you might have to push and chase again and again and again. In any event, so that's possibly what it means, mitzvah kala and mitzvah chamura. Some mitzvahs are easier to do and some are more difficult. But then he says something that appears to be self-contradictory. Why should you not prioritize, or why should you be careful about a simple mitzvah as you are about a so-called major mitzvah? She'ein ato yodea matan schoran shel mitzvos. Because you don't know the real reward for a mitzvah. Now this is an incredibly important principle. We create hierarchies in our own minds. And everybody has their particular hierarchy. For some people, at the top of that pyramid is the mitzvahs about how to treat another human being or your fellow Jew. More important than anything else. And those are the people who tell you the most important thing is to be kind. Or the most important thing is to be a mensch. Other people create a hierarchy that says, look, this mitzvah has so many things associated with it, it's obviously more important. So let's say the most important thing might be to learn Torah. The most important thing might be to keep Shabbos or not to speak Lashon Hara, whatever it is. So he's telling us an incredibly important thing. We don't know matan schoran shel mitzvahs. Nowhere in the Torah does it tell us this mitzvah brings you that reward. That mitzvah brings you that reward. Except for very, very unusual occasions, like the chasing the mother bird. There the Torah says, if you chase away the mother in order to take the young, then what's going to happen is you'll have long life. But other than that, the Torah speaks more generically. If you listen to me, if you listen to my statutes, then you'll have rain and you'll have peace and you'll have whatever you need. If you will listen to my mitzvahs, then you'll have everything that you need. But it's uncommon for the Torah to tell us, if you keep kosher, you'll get this blessing. And if you put a mezuzah, you'll get that blessing. We, over the course of time, have made associations between these things and understood that a mezuzah is there for protection. But that's not why we do the mitzvah. And that's not the matan schar, that's not the reward, it's kind of like a side benefit. So it's quite an important thing for us to remember that we don't actually know how to define what the reward for a mitzvah is. Yeah, so here's another example, kibod avayim, that it says if you honor your parents, it also says there that you'll have long life. So there are certain occasions, but by and large, if I had to ask you this question, there are 248 positive mitzvahs, and 365 negative mitzvahs. Out of the 365 negative mitzvahs, how many of them are we told what the consequences will be for transgressing them? It's interesting. Most of them. So if you look, for example, the Rambam gives us the full list of every single mitzvah every single transgression, for which a person would deserve capital punishment, every single transgression for which a person would deserve what's called misa b'dei shamayim, that Hashem truncates a person's life, God forbid, or kores, and which mitzvahs a person gets lashes. Sometimes there's an overlap between kores and lashes, right? But if you had to take the 248 mitzvahs and you had to list them and say, where are we told in the Torah what the rewards are? You're going to battle. You're actually going to battle to find them, because the Torah doesn't tell us matan schoran shel mitzvahs. Only one or two here or there, which is very interesting. So like I said, it sounds like what he's telling us is self-contradictory. Why? Because the very next thing he says, you don't know the reward for a mitzvah. He says, you don't know it. The very next thing he says is, you should calculate the potential loss that you would have from investing time or energy or money in doing a mitzvah versus the reward that you'll get for it. Now, 1 second, you just told me a minute ago that we don't know the reward. So how am I supposed to make this cheshbon? You've told me we don't know what the reward for mitzvahs is. And then you've told me calculate the loss versus the reward. Doesn't sound very helpful. And inversely, he says you should calculate the potential reward that you could get from doing an Aveira. In other words, I'm going to do something wrong and it will benefit me in the short term against the loss, the spiritual loss. That one I get, because I can understand what I stand in my mind to gain from doing something which is against the Torah. And then I can consult in the Torah and says, but if you do X and Y, this will be the punishment. So there I can make the cheshbon. But how does it work on the mitzvah side? The next part of the last part of the Mishnah could almost be standalone, actually, because he's told us that these are the principles that a person should follow. The Tiferes principle: don't decide a hierarchy of mitzvahs, and always consider the short-term investment versus the long-term gain of a mitzvah, and on the other hand, the short-term gain versus the long-term loss of an avera. And then he says this: Istakel b'shloisha devarim, focus on three things. Ve'ein ato ba lidei avera, and you will not sin. We're going to see a similar expression later on, and we'll analyze it in greater detail when we get there. The histakel b'shloisha devarim. So, because there's so much else in this Mishnah, we're not going to focus so much on the histakel b'shloisha devarim. But I will leave you with a question that can kind of keep you up at night until we get to the next time we talk about histakel b'shloisha devarim, and that is: does Rebbe think we can't count? Focus on three things. Okay, so they're the three things. Why do you have to tell me? As the Gemara often asks, minyana lomali, why is the number necessary? How does it add value to the understanding? But we're not going to delve into that in this Mishnah because there's enough other information to look at. So what are the three things? Okay, let's try to work this out. What are the three things? Da malamayla mimoch. The first thing is that you should be conscious of what is above you. In other words, the first thing is, don't read the world only in terms of what meets the eye. You should be looking beyond. Point number two, within that context, you should know that there's ayin roya v'oizen shama'as. There is an eye that sees everything and an ear that hears everything. By the way, that Rebbe was very much ahead of his time, clearly, because he must have known then about Google. That's right, they know everything that you do and everywhere that you go. It's the best parable that we've ever had in history for this concept of an eye that sees and an ear that hears. It's even better than George Orwell's 1984. And number three, v'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim. All of your deeds are recorded in this big supernal book. That's the book that's going to be open in 5 weeks, less than 5 weeks' time, on Rosh Hashanah, where Hashem pages through and he says, what did you do and what didn't you do? Okay, so this is the Mishnah so far at face value. And we've seen that there are a few questions that we've raised on this Mishnah. So let's take a look at those few questions.
Sorry, Rabbi, what was the second point?
The second of the three.
The second of the three, yes.
So, okay, so it's a good question to ask what was the second of the 3 points, because it actually all seems to be 1 point, actually. He says, know what is above you. That's point 1. Point number 2, and you're going to ask yourself the question, how is this point number 2? Surely it's part of point number 1. There's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. Point number 3, everything is recorded in a book. So I'm not sure if we will or won't have enough time today to analyze that part of the Mishnah thoroughly. Let's just see how we go. But those are the 3. What's above you, that there's an eye and an ear, and that everything is written. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Mishnah, and let's go one step further. So, why does he ask the question? Eizohi derech yeshara. What is the? How does this question even come into the conversation in the first place? The derech hayeshara, the ultimate upright, straight path that every single Jewish person should follow, is do what the Torah says. Why are you asking this question? Also, the answer, Tiferes. What do you mean Tiferes? What does that mean? So what we need to remember is that Pirkei Avos, as a theme, is what the Gemara calls Mili de Chasidusa. In other words, there are the bare bones, the black and white elements of Torah. This is what you have to do, what we call the din, the strict laws of the Torah, how you are supposed to behave as a Jewish person. And that's what we find in the rest of the Mishnah, and of course the Gemara's commentary on the Mishnah, and then how it develops into the various works of Jewish law of halacha. Pirkei Avos is unique because Pirkei Avos tells us how you behave lifnim mishuras hadin, beyond the requirement of the law. Mili de chasidusa, which means, mili de chasidusa means to push yourself beyond what is required. So what is required as a Jewish person? Bare bones, strictly speaking, black and white Judaism. What is required? Torah and mitzvahs. Comes along Pirkei Avos and says, within Torah and mitzvahs, we have a responsibility to ensure that the kind of conduct that we follow in Torah and mitzvahs is yeshara, is straight, is upright. In other words, he alludes right over here at the beginning, he alludes to the fact that it is quite possible for a person to follow the Torah in such a way that is not really upright. So how will you know? How will you know whether it is or isn't upright? For example, the Gemara makes a shocking statement. Harbe lomdu Torah v'shachachu al noisein ha-Torah. That there were many people who learnt Torah and forgot about the one who gave the Torah. Can you imagine such a thought? Can you imagine such a suggestion? Learning Torah and forgetting about the one who gave the Torah. Or for example, the Ramban talks about a concept of what is called novel birushus ha-Torah. That a person could be so-called despicable, and yet they could justify all of their behavior based on sources in the Torah. Can you imagine such a thing? Bizarre, right? It's bizarre to think. So it's possible for a person to observe Torah, to justify their behavior within Torah, or not even to get to the point of being novel, of being completely off the rails and behaving in a disgusting fashion and hiding behind what we call itztelad de kedusha, some kind of a cloak of holiness, and say, no, this is what the Torah requires. Besides that, it's even possible for a person not to be as off the mark as that, but to be off balance. So the Bar Tanura, who is the foremost commentator on the Mishnah, says, Derech Yeshara means that in Judaism, we don't want to become extremists. There are very few areas in Judaism where you're allowed to be extreme. You're allowed to be extreme when it comes to anger. So you go to the opposite extreme, to never be angry. And you're allowed to be extreme when it comes to arrogance. Ma'oid havei shfal ruach, as the expression goes. That you should be extremely, shfal ruach is more than even humble. Shfal ruach means to be like almost of a lowly spirit. Other than that, derech yeshara, the straight path, the upright path of Judaism, is to achieve derech hamemutza. That's the expression that the Rambam uses. Derech hamemutza, which means the middle path. A balance between extremes. It's especially relevant for Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi because he's a Nasi. He is the top person in the Jewish community. He has a tremendous amount of responsibility both to himself and to others. So it's quite appropriate that he would be a person who speaks to this issue of Derech Yeshara, because to be a Nasi, to be that ultimate Jewish leader, is very much about finding balance. If he's extreme on the one hand and takes all his communal responsibilities to the extreme and neglects his own personal development, eventually he's not going to be a good leader. And if he is completely focused on his personal development, then he certainly won't be a good leader. So what is he called Derech Yeshara? Something that is Tiferes Lo Oiseha, brings growth and development to the individual, and Tiferes Lo Min Ha'adam, and brings growth and benefit to others as well. So in the language of the Bar Tanura, he says this. Let's say, for example, when it comes to money. So when it comes to money, Tiferes La'oiseha, if a person was only fixated on their own well-being, which perhaps is the nature of capitalism, right? I need to make money, and I need to become successful. So if you only focus on Tiferes La'oiseha, you only focus on how you can do well yourself, Min ha'adam, everybody else is going to lose out. On the other hand, you're going to look in the Torah and say, the Torah says you have to be generous. The Torah says you have to give tzedakah. The Torah says that you have to lend people money. So you could say, I'll go to the opposite extreme. Help everybody and never retain anything for myself. So that's also not derech hayeshara. It sounds very noble, and it sounds like the kind of thing that, I guess at a hesped you'd say, what an amazing person. They gave everything away to everybody else. But it's not derech haTorah. It's not the way of Judaism. The way of Judaism is derech hayeshara, that a person should have a nice and a healthy balance between the two. So that's the concept that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wants to teach us. Now I'll tell you something interesting about being a Nasi. Like we've already identified, all of the people we've learnt about in the previous Mishnah, at least half of them were also in the position of Nasi. Hillel was a Nasi. Rabban Gamliel was a Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the only one where the title Nasi, the direct translation of Nasi is Prince. So Prince of Israel is actually part and parcel of his name that we use to refer to him until today. So that tells you out of all of the people who had the position of Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had it in a unique fashion. And there are various ways you can see that in his life. Number one, he was the person from a Torah perspective who collated all of the oral Torah into the Mishnah. So you see, he's like this teacher par excellence. We know that he was an incredibly wealthy person. So he's a Nasi in the classic sense, to the ultimate. We know that he rubbed shoulders with the leadership of the Roman Empire at the time. So he was a Nasi in the political sense. So he really represents what a Nasi is all about. There's a tradition that we have that the word Nasi, which is spelled Nun, Sin, Yud, Aleph, is an abbreviation for 4 words. Nitzutz, a spark, shell of Yaakov Avinu. That to be a Nasi means that it's not just somebody who was put into a position because they had particular talents. Maybe that's how it is in terms of Jewish leadership today. Whoever happens to have the best talents lands up in the leadership positions. But in those days, to be a Nasi meant, and by extension throughout the course of our history, those individuals who weren't just leaders of the community, but were the great, so to speak, luminaries, the ultimate tzaddik of a generation, is called Nitzutz Shel Yaakov Avinu. Somebody who has a spark of the soul of Yaakov in their soul. Why is that relevant to us? Obviously, we have 3 patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But what's unique about Yaakov is that all of his children are Bnei Yisrael. They're all Jewish. Avraham had many children. He had Yishmael, obviously became the founder and progenitor of the entire Arab world. He had other sons who he sent off to the east, and may very well be those who started the eastern civilizations. Yitzchak had Esav. Esav is the progenitor of the archenemy of the Jewish nation, Edom. So Yaakov has a specific connection to us because he is the one that all of his children remained faithful to Hashem and to the precepts of Judaism. So therefore, a Nasi, who is the caretaker and the spiritual shepherd for the Jewish people, he's a Nitzutz of Yaakov Avinu. Now, when you look at it spiritually, we're told that Avraham and Yitzchak had 2 extreme versions of how to serve Hashem. Avraham's version of how to serve Hashem was extreme in chesed. Be kind, be tolerant, have anybody in your house without judgment, go out and defend the indefensible when he tries to save the people of Sodom. Go out and share godliness with everybody. It's a chesed-like relationship with Hashem. And so for that reason, he is an extremist of chesed. Unfortunately, even if you're the kindest person in the world, if it's an extreme position, it's not always sustainable for the next generation. So you have somebody like Yishmael, and because Abraham was such a tolerant individual, he tolerated Yishmael's behavior. It was Sarah who put her foot down and said, get this guy out of here, he's a bad influence over my son. But because Abraham was tolerant of Yishmael, so Yishmael went off and did his own thing. So it's an extreme position of Torah, but it's not derech hayeshara. It's not the way we're supposed to follow. It was good for Abraham. He had his particular mission in this world. But for you and I, we can't learn from that to become extreme in that way. Yitzchak was the exact opposite. Yitzchak's relationship with Hashem is, as the Torah says, Pachad Yitzchak. Pachad. His relationship with Hashem is unlike Avram, who's called Avram Oy Havi. Avram, who loves me, So that's love and chesed are synonymous concept. The same kind of person who is kind and generous and tolerant will also relate to Hashem through primarily love. Yitzchak is pachad Yitzchak. Pachad is fear. That's a completely different approach to godliness and a completely different approach to serving Hashem. That is an approach that is called the Gevura approach. Stern, focused, with high expectations. It's quite similar to what we learned about in the previous chapter as the distinction between Hillel and Shammai. So Yitzchak, for example, if his father tells him at the age of 37 that we're going to slaughter you as a way to serve Hashem, you don't find that Yitzchak protests at all. He says, here I am. Vayomer hineni. I'm here. I'm ready. Whatever you want. Why? Because his approach to godliness is you do the things that are tough and you do the things that require tremendous discipline and make huge demands on you. So he's an extremist in the opposite direction. His extremism is that the way you serve Hashem is with absolute, focused, disciplined dedication. Again, it was his mission. That was the nature and makeup of his neshama, but it's not derech yeshara for us. It's not the way that we're supposed to behave. We're not supposed to go off into some kind of heavy, overwhelming, just disciplined, gevura relationship with Hashem. Because he went to that extreme, he had a son called Esav. And Esav was also gevura oriented. And he took from his father, as we know very well, Esav was an expert at taking what he wanted out of a situation. So as Rashi says, Tzayid befiv, that when it says that he was like he hunted his father with his mouth. So Rashi says, what does it mean, Tzayid befiv? It means that every time he had a conversation with his father, he played the game. He extracted out of Judaism whatever he thought would impress his father to use for himself. So Esav sees that his father is this very high, stern, disciplined, I don't want to use the word aggressive because that wouldn't be appropriate, but Esav took the aggression out of it. Gevura is the way. So he also goes off the path. Yaakov, we're told, is Titain Emes LeYaakov. The Pasuk tells us that Yaakov is Midas HaEmes, the attribute of truth. And truth can never exist in an extreme position. So instead, truth exists in a position we call Tiferes. What's beauty? What's beauty? What makes something beautiful? Imagine this. Imagine for 1 second that you had a lot of money suddenly available, you had a windfall, and you decided that you're going to completely redecorate your house. So you hire the best interior decorator that you could possibly find. You speak around at Kosher World, they tell you who the best interior decorator is. So you hire their services and you say, listen, I'm giving you 3 weeks in my house. Here's the budget. Do whatever, make my house absolutely beautiful. I'm going on holiday. When I come back, I'd like to see what you've done. So before you go, the interior decorator says, I have only one question for you. Leave it to me, I'm a professional. I have just one question for you. What is your favorite color? So you say that your favorite color is what? I don't know. Let's just make this fun and say your favorite color is orange. Let's just say, just to make it more fun. And off you go down to the coast and you have your 3 weeks and you cannot wait to get back home and see this magnificent masterpiece that will be your house. You open the front door and your entrance hall has been painted orange. On the floor there's an orange rug. On the wall is a beautiful painting that is different shades of orange. You walk through there into your living room, the couches are orange, the carpet is orange, the curtains are orange, the walls are painted orange, your kitchen is orange, you even have an orange oven. The bedroom is orange, the kids' rooms are orange, the passageway is orange, the dining room is orange. You never knew that it was possible to actually have an orange dining room table. And the interior decorator standing there, obviously with a huge grin, say, "No, what do you think?" And you pretty much think that you're about to throttle the interior decorator because you don't want to live in an asylum. You know, that's where they have everything the same color. All the walls, the floor, the bed, everything is the same color. That's not beautiful. Beautiful, Tiferes, is where you have contrast. You need other colors that will make the orange stand out and look magnificent. So that's Tiferes. Tiferes is the blend of different things that work in a sort of a tense harmony, where there's a little bit of a pull in this way and then a pull back that way. That's what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wants us to know. Ezohi derech yeshara. How do you know that you're serving Hashem the right way? Kol shetiferes leoiseha. If your experience of your Judaism is about the harmonious blend called Tiferes, which means, what does it mean practically? That means two possible things. The one is, as we've already seen from the Bar Tanura, that it is possible for a person to become extreme, that my whole Judaism is about me, how frum I am. And with that, I might overlook other people. And I might even mistreat other people along the way. You're not frum enough. You're not coming into my house like that. So it reminds me of a story that I once heard of a fellow, I heard it not long ago actually, of a particular family, rabbi in a community. I don't know where it is and I don't know who the people are. And they had a daughter who kind of moved and drifted from Jewish practice. And she'd come to visit them, and they obviously wanted to retain her relationships, their daughter, obviously. But the way that she would arrive at the house was with a dress code that they would never have tolerated for any of the other children. So they made a very strict rule. If you want to walk into this house, this is how you have to dress. So she stopped coming. You can imagine it broke their hearts. So this particular rabbi spoke to a friend and colleague and said, what do you think I should do? So the friend said, I want to ask you a question. When your child grew up in your house, did you ever invite guests over who were not religious? He says, of course. He says, did you ever insist on a particular dress code before they walked through the door? Or did you just accept them as they are? He says, to be honest, I never insisted on it. I mean, it's more important to engage people and to connect them with their Judaism. He says, so you understand that your daughter grew up her whole life seeing that that's how you view everybody else. But now when it comes to her, you can't accept her for who she is. Treat her like you would treat anybody else. And that became the beginning of the healing of their relationship, both in terms of their family connection and also in terms of her warming a little bit more to her Jewish experience. So, kol shetiferes lo iseha v'tiferes lo min ha'adam. The first level is that a person has to find a good balance between my own spiritual development and the way that influences how I touch and connect with other people. My spiritual development should not come at the cost of my relationship with somebody else, and certainly not at the cost of my potential to be able to touch and inspire somebody else. But there's another layer as well. What does Tiferes Lo Iseha mean? We're all guilty of this. Every single one of us is guilty of this. Of what? Of picking and choosing. This relates to the next part of the Mishnah. We all have our things about Judaism that we say, this speaks to me. This I enjoy. I happen to be a more outgoing, loving, kind, tolerant, generous kind of personality. So all of those things in Judaism that speak about helping people and inviting guests over for Shabbos and all that, I'm good at that. The personal discipline aspects, things like be punctual about lighting Shabbos candles, or when I'm learning or davening, I shouldn't be distracted by anything else. I should be very focused. Or to keep my mouth shut when it's time, when I've got a really juicy piece of Lashon Hara to share. I'm not so good at that. Or vice versa. Some of us are very good at that kind of stuff. We like the discipline, we like the regiment, we like the parts of Judaism that are very much about Seder, about structure. The parts of Judaism that require us to step out of our comfort zone. Maybe I'm an introvert and I don't necessarily enjoy going to pay a shiva call or visiting the sick or phoning somebody to see how they're doing or outreach or whatever the case. I don't necessarily enjoy it. So that's Tiferes. Tiferes is, if you want beauty in your Judaism, or Derech Yeshara as he calls it over here, if you want the upright, straight path of Judaism, it cannot only go in a single direction. That's not beauty, that's extremism. The goal of Judaism is to create a harmonious blend between the different aspects of Yiddishkeit, those that I'm naturally inclined to, as well as those that I struggle with. That's why he says, have a zohar b'mitzvah kalo kevach hamura, that you should be as cautious about what you feel is a lesser mitzvah, as you would be cautious about the things that you feel are a more serious mitzvah, because we all have our own self-generated hierarchy of Judaism. And that's how we know that we're serving Hashem and not just serving ourselves. And by the way, that relates to the expression Zahir. What does Zahir mean? I think we've touched on this already once before. So what does Zahir mean? There are two ways you could translate it. There's the literal translation. Zahir means be very, very cautious. Be pedantic. The other way you could translate it, as the Baal Shem Tov does, is that the word Zahir comes from the word Zohar, which is radiance. The Gemara has a very interesting section